The station hung in the dark like a polished bone. It turned slowly, catching the light of 3 distant suns, its outer ring spinning to make gravity for the thousands of beings who lived and worked inside it. The station was called Velshar Prime, and it was the most important place in the known galaxy, not because of its size, though it was enormous, but because of what happened inside it. Decisions were made on Velshar Prime. Big decisions. The kind that changed maps and rewrote history books. Today, one of those decisions was about to be made. The Grand Hall of the Interstellar Union was packed. Every seat was filled. Species from dozens of worlds sat, stood, floated, or crouched in their designated sections, arranged in a great sweeping curve around the central platform. The air was a mix of gases tuned carefully to suit everyone, a little thick, a little strange, but breathable for all. The walls were tall and pale, and the light came from soft panels that had been adjusted to a warm, neutral tone after a long argument about whose eyes found what comfortable. At the center of it all stood Elder Voss. He was Shalari. That meant he was tall, nearly 3 meters, with skin the color of ash and 6 eyes arranged in 2 horizontal rows across a wide, flat face. He was also very old, even by Shalari standards, which meant he had been alive for something close to 600 Earth years. He wore long gray robes and carried himself the way very old, very important beings often did, like the room owed him something. He had been speaking for 40 minutes. "The evidence," Elder Voss said, his voice low and smooth and amplified across the hall by a small disc at his throat, "is quite clear. The concept of a so-called death world has never been supported by rigorous science. It is a story, a myth passed between frightened explorers who encountered difficult environments and chose to label those environments as impossible rather than simply challenging." There were sounds of agreement from around the hall, clicks and hums and low vibrations that translated through the universal interpreter built into every seat as things like yes and well said, and finally someone is addressing this. Elder Voss smiled with 4 of his 6 eyes, the Shalari way of showing deep satisfaction. "Every planet in the known galaxy," he continued, "is a matter of correct preparation, correct equipment, correct biology enhanced where necessary with modern medical support. There is no world that is simply and inherently lethal. To say otherwise is not science, it is fear. And fear, my colleagues, has no place in our registry." He gestured toward the massive display behind him. It showed the current list of planets marked with the red sigil of the Deathworld classification, a category that had existed in the Union's records for over 2 centuries. There were 31 planets on that list. "I move," Elder Voss said, "to remove this classification entirely, to strike the term from the official registry, effective immediately, and to reclassify all listed planets under the standard hazard tier system, where they belong." The vote prompt appeared on every delegate's desk panel, a simple choice, yes or no. The hall filled with the soft sound of panels being pressed. In the back of the hall, in the human section, a modest cluster of 12 seats that had been assigned to humanity when they joined the Union 8 years ago, a young woman named Sierra Vance sat with her legs crossed and her hands folded in her lap. She was 29 years old, with dark brown skin, short natural hair, and eyes that were very calm and very still. She wore the standard blue field jacket of a Union delegate, slightly too large for her, with a small Earth flag stitched to the left shoulder. She looked at the vote prompt on her panel. She did not press yes. She did not press no. She waited. The tally came up on the big display. 37 species, 37 yes votes. Except 1 abstention. The presiding arbiter, a round, pale creature from the water world of Mu, with 4 arms and a voice like wet gravel, looked at the tally and then looked toward the human section with all 3 of its eyes. "Delegate Vance," it said, "the human delegation has submitted an abstention. Can you clarify your position?" Every head in the hall turned. Every set of eyes, however many that happened to be, found the small human woman in the too large jacket sitting in the back row. Sira did not seem bothered by the attention. She unfolded her hands and sat up a little straighter. She looked at the presiding arbiter with that same calm expression. "No strong objection," she said. Her voice came out flat through the interpreter. "I just suggest we table the discussion for now." A ripple of confused sounds moved through the hall. The interpreter translated them variously as puzzling and unnecessary hesitation, and from the Shalari section, something that came through as typical human caution. Elder Voss turned to face her section with polite patience, the way someone turns to explain something obvious to a child. "Delegate Vance, with respect, the motion is already supported by the full scientific literature of 7 major civilizations. Is there a specific concern you wish to raise? A data set? A counter-study?" Sira thought about it for a moment. She tilted her head slightly. Outside the tall windows behind her section, the distant stars turned with the slow rotation of the station. "No," she said, "no counter-study." "Then your abstention is noted," the arbiter said, not unkindly. "But the motion passes. 37 in favor. The Deathworld classification is hereby removed from the official registry, effective at the close of this session." The hall responded with something that translated, universally, as applause, though it sounded different from every section depending on the species producing it. Sira Vance looked at the tally board for a moment. Then she picked up the small canteen of water she kept beside her chair, took a slow sip, and set it back down. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She did not make a speech about Earth, or about the things she had seen, or about the reason she knew. In the deep and specific way you only know things that have been taught to you by pain, that some places in the universe were not simply challenging. They were in the business of killing you. And they were very, very good at their business. But she said none of that, not yet. She simply sat there in the back of the grand hall, while 37 civilizations celebrated the removal of a word from a list, and she thought about home, about red skis before a tornado, about the sound the ocean made before a wave got too big, about the specific smell of a forest that was deciding to be on fire. She thought about Earth. And for just a second, the corner of her mouth moved in something that was almost a smile, though no one in the hall was watching closely enough to see it, and even if they had been, none of them would have understood what it meant. It meant, "You'll understand eventually." It meant, "I'm not going to argue with you." It meant, "The universe will explain it better than I ever could." The session moved on to other business. The Deathworld classification was gone. The list was wiped clean. 31 planets, once marked with the red sigil of warning, were now simply challenging environments waiting to be explored. One of them, a jungle ocean world in the outer systems called Keth 4, had already been selected for a scientific expedition. The departure date was in 6 weeks. Sira Vance was on the crew list. She had asked to be. The ship was called the UIS Boundless Inquiry, and it was a beautiful vessel, long and white, with wide observation decks and research bays that smelled of clean metal and filtered air. It carried 12 scientists from 6 different species, a crew of 8, and enough supplies for a 4-month planetary stay. It left Velshar Prime on a clear departure window, sliding out of dock with a soft hum, and set course for the outer systems. Sira Vance stood at the observation window in the common area and watched the station shrink behind them until it was just a bright dot among many bright dots, and then nothing at all. She had a cup of black coffee in her hand. She had brought her own supply, 3 kilograms of ground beans in vacuum-sealed bags. The ship's kitchen could produce something it called coffee, but Sira had tried it once and decided that whatever it was not that. She drank and watched the stars and said nothing. The lead scientist on the expedition was Dr. Orvith. He was also Shalari, like Elder Voss, though younger, perhaps only 200 years old, which in Shalari terms made him something like a driven professional in his middle career. He was thinner than Voss, with sharper features, and he moved through the ship with quick, precise steps, carrying a data tablet that he read while walking, which the other species found impressive and slightly alarming. His 6 eyes could look in slightly different directions at once, so he could read, walk, and monitor his surroundings simultaneously without slowing down. He had reviewed the crew manifest before departure and spent approximately 45 seconds on Sira's file. Human, 29 years, junior field researcher, degree in xenobiology from a university on Earth, 1 prior Union expedition to a catalogued ocean world, uneventful, fluent in 2 Earth languages and passable in Shalari Standard. He had noted her presence the way you note a piece of equipment you didn't choose, but are obligated to bring, acknowledged, filed, not thought about again. On the 3rd day of travel, they were formally introduced at the expedition briefing. Orvith stood at the head of the long table in the main research bay, with holographic charts of Keth 4 rotating slowly in the air beside him. The planet looked stunning even in projection, deep blue oceans interrupted by masses of dense green-gold jungle, with cloud patterns that swirled in long, slow spirals. It looked, to anyone who had never visited it, like paradise. Keth 4 has been reclassified as a Class 2 environment, Orvith said, moving through the briefing with practiced efficiency. Elevated humidity, above-average atmospheric pressure, and a rich biosphere, but nothing that standard equipment cannot manage. Previous survey teams flagged certain fauna as potentially aggressive, but those reports have been reviewed, and the behaviors noted were either defensive responses to poor approach protocol or misidentified entirely. We should have no serious difficulties. He tapped his tablet and the hologram shifted to show the base camp layout. We will establish a primary research station here on the coastal shelf. We have 6 weeks of scheduled surface time. The goals are environmental sampling, biodiversity cataloging, and a preliminary geological survey of the eastern shelf. The other researchers asked questions. Orvith answered them quickly and well. The briefing moved smoothly. Toward the end, Orvith looked at Sira almost as an afterthought. Delegate Vance, you are assigned to biome sampling, Sector 3. You'll be working with researcher Thel. He gestured to a small, 4-armed being from a world called Pesh, who blinked its wide amber eyes at Sira in greeting. Any questions? What's the local predator profile for Sector 3? Sira asked. Orvith checked his tablet. 2 cataloged species, both listed as non-aggressive outside of nesting season, which is 4 months away. Standard monitoring will be sufficient. Sira nodded slowly. And the microbial environment. The survey report listed some unusual spore activity in the eastern jungle zones. Orvith looked at her for just a moment longer than he had looked at anyone else during the briefing. It was not a hostile look. It was more like the look of someone who has been handed a question they did not expect from that direction. Standard respirator filtration will handle it, he said. It was flagged in the report as a minor notation, not a hazard. Right, Sira said. She did not push further. Thel, sitting beside her, leaned over on 2 of its 4 arms and whispered through its small translator pin. You have concerns. Not yet, Sira said quietly. Just questions. Keth 4 came into view on the 8th day of travel. Through the observation windows, it was even more beautiful than the hologram had suggested. The oceans were the deep, rich blue of something old and heavy, and the jungles caught the light of the local star in a way that made them glow faintly gold-green, like everything was permanently mid-afternoon. The cloud cover was thick in the northern hemisphere but clear in the south, where they were landing. Sira pressed her hand flat against the observation window glass and looked down at the planet for a long time. She was not thinking about how beautiful it was. She was thinking about the way the canopy moved, about how there were no clearings in the jungle sections, not a single open patch, which meant either the competition for sunlight was extremely intense, or something moved through the canopy regularly enough to keep clearings from forming. About the color variation in the ocean near the coastal shelf, slightly darker in patches, in a way that suggested depth changes or thermal activity or both. She was cataloging, automatically without deciding to, the way you do when something in the back of your mind says pay attention. They landed on the coastal shelf in the early morning hours of Keth4's day cycle. The ramp lowered and the warm, thick air of the planet rolled in like a slow wave, humid, rich, smelling of salt, and something sweet that none of them had a name for yet. The alien researchers stepped out one by one and looked around with open expressions of wonder. One of them, a tall blue-skinned being named Vel, made a sound that its translator rendered as extraordinary. Two others immediately began setting up sensor equipment, moving quickly with the eagerness of scientists who have traveled a long way for new data. Sierra came down the ramp last. She stood on the pale gray sand of the coastal shelf and took one slow breath through her standard respirator. Then she looked left, then right, then up at the canopy line, maybe 300 meters inland, where the jungle began in a dense, unbroken wall of gold green. Nothing moved. The air was still. The ocean behind them made a low, regular sound. It was very quiet for a jungle that size. Sierra noted that and said nothing. The first day went well. The base camp was established without problems. Sensors went up, samples were collected, everyone ate dinner in the common shelter, and agreed that the planet was everything the reclassified survey had promised. Orvith reviewed the day's data and called it an excellent start. There was a general feeling of ease in the camp that evening, the relieved, happy ease of people who had traveled far and arrived somewhere that had not immediately tried to hurt them. Sierra set up her bunk, checked her personal kit, first aid supplies, secondary respirator, water filter, emergency signal device, and then sat on the edge of her cot for a while. Thel came in and settled onto its own bunk nearby. "You are not sleeping?" it asked. "Not yet," Sierra said, "just listening." "Listening to what?" Sierra was quiet for a moment. Outside, the camp's perimeter lights were on, casting pale circles on the sand. The jungle wall sat dark and still in the distance. "Nothing," she said, "that's the problem." Thel processed this for a moment, then closed its amber eyes and went to sleep, because it was tired and the planet had been kind today, and there was no immediate reason for concern. Sierra lay back and stared at the ceiling of the shelter. She had grown up in a place that could also be beautiful and still and sweet-smelling, and golden-lit in the afternoon. And she had learned very young that those were often the hours right before it decided to remind you what it was. She closed her eyes. She didn't sleep for a long time. On the second day, 3 researchers from different species woke up struggling to breathe. On the third night, the things that lived in the canopy came down. Keth4 had noticed them. And Keth4, it turned out, was not indifferent to visitors. The camp was not quiet anymore. Researcher Vel was on the ground inside the medical shelter, breathing in slow, difficult pulls, its blue skin gone pale and dull. 2 others, a Pesci like Thel, and a round-bodied being named Korath from a water world, were sitting upright but struggling, their eyes half closed, their movements sluggish. The ship's basic medical unit was running scans and producing results that nobody on the team had been trained to interpret in the field, because nobody had expected to need to. Dr. Orvith stood in the middle of the camp with his data tablet and his 6 eyes moving in 6 directions at once, and for the first time since leaving Velshar Prime, he looked like a being who did not know what to do next. The night before had been bad. The things from the canopy had not been large. That was almost the worst part. They were small, dark, fast-moving creatures, no bigger than a human hand that came in the hundreds and moved along the ground in a quiet, coordinated wave. They had not attacked directly. They had simply moved through the camp, and wherever they passed, they left a faint residue on every surface. The ground, the equipment, the outer walls of the shelters. By morning, 3 researchers who had stepped outside without full suit coverage had absorbed enough of that residue through skin contact to cause what the medical scanner called progressive neural disruption. It was, in plain terms, a slow-acting poison. Orvith was on the communicator with the ship, trying to get the medical system to cross-reference the compound. The ship's doctor, a Shalari physician who had been perfectly confident 2 days ago, was speaking in a fast, tight voice that did not inspire calm. Sira was not on the communicator. She was on her knees in the dirt at the edge of the camp, where the pale gray sand met the first line of low ground cover plants. She had her sample kit open beside her, and she was moving through the plants methodically, pressing leaves between her fingers, smelling them, occasionally touching the tip of her tongue to one, and then spitting carefully. Thel found her there. "What are you doing?" it asked, its forearms folded in a posture its translator usually rendered as worried. "Looking for something," Sira said without looking up. "The doctor on the ship says we need to wait for a synthesized counteragent. It will take approximately 18 hours to." "Vel doesn't have 18 hours, Sira said simply. She moved to the next plant, pressed a leaf, smelled it, set it aside. Thel was quiet. "Then, you know what you are looking for." "Maybe." She picked up a low, broad-leafed plant with a faint gray-green color and held it up to the morning light. The underside of the leaf had a faint waxy coating that caught the light in a specific way. She smelled it again. Then she sat back on her heels and let out a small breath through her nose. "Yes, this one." She was 11 years old, and it was summer in Montana, and her grandmother's hands were rough and certain as they moved through the tall grass at the edge of the creek bed. "This one," her grandmother had said, holding up a broad, flat leaf with a waxy underside. "You remember this one. Tastes like nothing, smells a little like rain. If something bites you and your hand starts going numb, you chew this and you hold it on the spot." "Does it work?" Sira had asked. Her grandmother had smiled. "Kept your great-uncle alive long enough to get to a hospital. Good enough for me." The plant on Keth 4 was not the same plant. Nothing on Keth 4 was the same as anything on Earth, but the waxy coating on the leaf contained a compound her nose recognized, not identical, but close enough in structure to what she was looking for. The chemistry of life, she had learned in her first year of xenobiology, repeated itself across the galaxy more often than anyone expected. Different shapes, different colors, same underlying solutions to the same underlying problems. She harvested a careful amount, brought it back to the medical shelter, and spent 40 minutes working at the portable analysis unit, cross-referencing the leaf compound against the toxin profile the scanner had pulled from Vel's bloodstream. She was not a doctor. She had never claimed to be. But she had taken every elective her university offered that touched on field medicine, field chemistry, and xenobotany, because she had grown up understanding that knowing things did not cost you anything and ignorance could cost you everything. The compound was not a cure, but it would slow the toxin's progress enough to buy Vel the time it needed. She administered it carefully. The scanner confirmed, 20 minutes later, that Vel's neural disruption rate had dropped by 60%. Orvith stood in the doorway of the medical shelter and watched her write up her field notes on the procedure with a steady hand. He did not say anything for a long time. The camp repairs took most of that day. The creature residue had to be cleaned from every surface with a specific solvent that Sira identified from the ship's chemical stores after 2 hours of testing. The perimeter sensors were reconfigured. Sira spent 3 hours on this herself, recalibrating the motion detection to pick up small mass movement in high numbers, rather than large mass movement individually. The original settings had been designed for big predators. The assumption had been that big was dangerous and small was not. That assumption had come from worlds where it was mostly true. By evening, the camp was cleaner and better defended, and the 3 sick researchers were stable. Orvith called a team meeting and went through the new safety protocols in a careful, efficient voice. He was good at regaining composure. It was one of the things that made him a good scientist. But at the end of the meeting, when the others were dispersing, he looked at Sierra with an expression that was harder to classify than his usual expressions. "The plant compound," he said. "How did you know?" "I didn't know," she said honestly. "I had a reasonable guess based on prior experience." "Prior experience with what?" She looked at him for a moment. "With places that want to kill you," she said. "You learn to look for patterns. Poisons tend to have counters nearby. Not always, but often enough to check first." Orvith processed this. "That is not in any standard field protocol I have reviewed." "No," she agreed. "It's not something you can really put in a protocol." He seemed about to say something else. Instead, he looked down at his tablet and then back up at her. "Get some sleep, Delegate Vance. Tomorrow we are restructuring the sample rotations." She nodded and turned to go. "And Delegate Vance." She stopped. "Thank you," he said. The word came out slightly carefully, like he was making sure it landed correctly. "For Vel." She gave him a small nod and walked back to her shelter. That night was calmer. The perimeter sensors picked up two small movements that turned out to be nothing threatening. The camp held. The researchers slept in shifts, and the morning came gray and warm and thick with humidity. Then the ground shook. It was not violent. It was a long, slow roll, like something enormous turning over deep underground, and it lasted for about 8 seconds and then stopped. Equipment rattled. One of the sample containers fell off a shelf. Sierra was already awake and already at the entrance of her shelter, looking toward the jungle when it ended. Orvith appeared beside her. "Minor seismic event," he said, reading from his tablet. "The original survey noted occasional low-level tectonic activity. It should not." "Look at the canopy," Sierra said quietly. He looked. The gold-green wall of the jungle, which had been still since they landed, was moving. Not in the way trees move in wind. There was no wind. It was moving from within. Something was disturbing it from underneath, from the roots up, in a wide-spreading pattern that moved away from their direction in fast, silent waves. Everything in the jungle was running away from the coast. Sierra watched the moving canopy for 3 long seconds. Then she turned and walked very quickly back into the camp. "We need to move everything off the coastal shelf," she said, loudly enough for the whole camp to hear. "Right now, everything up to the high ground markers. Move." "The seismic reading was minor," Orvith began. "The animals don't think so," Sierra said, "and they live here." There was a half-second pause in the camp where everyone looked at Orvith, who looked at the moving canopy, and then looked at Sierra. He gave the order. They moved. 14 minutes later, the coastal shelf flooded. A wall of dark water came in from the ocean, quiet and fast and knee-deep, and swept through exactly the space where the base camp had been standing. It receded in under a minute, leaving the sand dark and rearranged and scattered with small ocean creatures that had no business being on land. The team stood on the high ground and looked down at the wet, empty shelf. Nobody said anything for a while. Then Thel, standing beside Sierra with all 4 arms very still, said in a low voice, "How did you know?" Sierra watched the last of the water pull back from the sand below. "Animals are smarter than surveys," she said. Orvith stood 2 meters away, tablet in hand, looking at the flooded shelf with an expression that none of his colleagues had ever seen on his face before. It was the expression of a being who was beginning, slowly and seriously, to reconsider something he had been very certain about. The base camp was gone. Not destroyed, not burned, just gone, erased by the flood as cleanly as writing wiped from a board. The coastal shelf was wet and bare, and the pale gray sand had been replaced by dark ocean silt. The supply crates that had not been moved in time were scattered across the shelf in a long, uneven line, half buried and cracked open. The camp's primary shelter was on its side 40 meters from where it had been standing. One wall caved inward, the frame bent. They had saved the essential equipment. Sira had prioritized during the move communications array first, then the medical unit, then the sample storage, then personal kits. She had called it out loud while people ran. And they had followed the order because her voice had been the only one giving direction, and there had not been time to question it. Now 12 beings stood on the high ground and looked at the damage, and the silence between them was the specific kind of silence that comes after something has gone very wrong, and the full weight of it is only just arriving. Orvith was already on the communicator with the boundless inquiry in orbit. The ship could not land. The flood had destabilized the coastal shelf, and the landing sensors were showing ground integrity as insufficient. An emergency extraction was possible, but the ship would need a clear, flat surface of a minimum 40 meters, and the nearest option was an inland plateau that the survey maps showed as 42 kilometers east, through the jungle. 42 kilometers, through Keth-4's jungle. On foot. Orvith looked at the map on his tablet, then at the jungle wall, then at his team of 12, 3 of whom were still recovering from the toxin exposure, one of whom was Vel, who could walk but could not move fast. He looked at all of this with the steady, careful face of a scientist doing an assessment, and the assessment was not good. "We move at first light," Sira said from beside him. She was already looking at the jungle. "We follow the elevated ridge line. It's slower, but it keeps us off the flood plain and above the canopy root zone. Smaller things tend to stay in the low, wet areas. The ridge gives us visibility and better footing." Orvith looked at the map. She was right. "That adds roughly 6 kilometers to the route," he said. "Better than 6 kilometers of swamp," she said. He did not argue. That evening, Sira rebuilt the perimeter from scratch using what they had salvaged. She stripped non-essential parts from 2 damaged equipment cases and rigged a secondary motion alarm along the tree line, lower to the ground this time, calibrated for small movement. She packed and repacked her own field kit twice, removing everything that was not directly useful and replacing it with things that were extra filtration cartridges, a compact trauma kit from the medical stores, 2 emergency flares, a length of cable strong enough to hold body weight. Thel watched her do this and asked if it could help. "Yes," she said. "Check everyone's boots for fit. If someone's feet give out on the ridge trail, we all slow down." Thel went and did it without question. 3 pairs of boots needed adjustment. It fixed them. They left at dawn. The jungle was not what the survey documents had described. The survey had called it dense but navigable. What they walked into was a living wall, layered, loud, and deeply uninterested in being navigated. The canopy above them was so thick that the sky was barely visible, just occasional small patches of pale light far overhead. The ground was a tangle of root systems that rose in arching loops above the soil and then plunged back down, so that every step required attention, and the path forward was a constant series of small climbs and drops. The air under the canopy was heavier than on the coast, thicker with moisture, with spores, with the smell of growth and rot happening simultaneously everywhere at once. Sira moved at the front of the group. She set the pace steady, not fast, deliberate. She watched the ground for surface changes and the mid-level of the jungle for movement and the behavior of smaller creatures for signs of anything larger nearby. Small animals, when something big was close, went quiet and flat. She had learned that at 8 years old in the forests of British Columbia on a camping trip where a bear had wandered close to the trail, and the birds had stopped singing 30 seconds before it appeared. The group moved in silence. Even the researchers who had been talkative on the ship had gone quiet. The jungle did that. It had a weight to it, not threatening exactly, just present, in the way that a very large and very awake thing is present even when it is not moving. By midday they had covered 18 kilometers. Vel was struggling but moving. Korath, the water world researcher, was having difficulty with the humidity and stopped every 30 minutes to regulate its breathing with a device it carried in its chest harness. Orvith stayed close to the back of the group, monitoring everyone's biometrics on his tablet, watching for drops in the numbers. They stopped to eat and rest on a wide section of the ridge, where the root systems thinned and there was flat ground enough to sit. Sierra did not sit. She walked the perimeter of the rest stop in a slow circle, looking outward, eating a compressed ration bar without tasting it. Orvith approached her. He looked tired. "You do not rest?" he asked. "I'll rest when we're on the ship," she said. She had said it lightly, almost automatically, and she did not think much of it. It was simply what you said. It was what her father had said, working double shifts at the fabrication plant in Sao Paulo. It was what the rescue team leader had said on the radio after the earthquake, when Sierra had been 16 and trapped in a collapsed building for 11 hours before they reached her. "We'll rest when we're done." Orvith studied her face for a moment. "You are not afraid," he said. It came out less like a compliment and more like a genuine question, the way a scientist names something he cannot classify. Sierra chewed her ration bar and looked out at the jungle. "I'm afraid," she said. "I just don't have time to stop for it right now." He seemed to think about this for a long time. They were 4 kilometers from the extraction plateau when the jungle changed. It did not make a sound. That was the first thing. A jungle with this much life in it should always be making sound, insects, birds, small things in the underbrush. And until now it had been a constant low background noise that they had all stopped hearing because it was always there. And then it stopped. Sierra stopped walking. The group behind her stopped because she stopped. In the silence, something moved through the upper canopy ahead of them. Something very large, moving with a slow, deliberate weight that bent the high branches and released them one by one in a rhythmic pattern. It was not running. It was walking, and it was walking toward them. "Off the path," Sierra said very quietly. "Into the root cover. Lo, do not move." They moved. Orvith got Vel down behind a wide root arch. Thel pulled Korath flat against the base of a tree. Everyone went low and still within about 30 seconds, everyone except Sierra, who remained standing in the middle of the path. "Vance," Orvith said from behind her in a very tight voice, "get down." She did not get down. The thing that came out of the upper canopy was enormous. 6 limbs, the front 4 used for movement and the rear 2 folded against its body. It was the color of the jungle, mottled dark green and gold, perfectly matched to the light filtering down through the canopy. Its head was wide and low, and it moved on a long, flexible neck that swept slowly from side to side as it walked, testing the air. It was at least 8 meters long. Its footfalls made the ground faintly tremble. And it had already found their scent. Its neck was turning in their direction. Sierra took one slow breath. Then she picked up a piece of dead branch from the ground, snapped it once, loud as a crack of wood can be in a quiet jungle, and threw it hard to the left, far off the path into the underbrush. The creature's head snapped toward the sound. Its whole body pivoted, fast and sudden in a way that did not match its size, and it moved off the path to the left, pushing through the undergrowth toward the sound. Sierra said low and fast, "Move now, quick and quiet." They moved. All of them up and forward, along the ridge path, fast and low, while the creature crashed through the underbrush 20 meters to their left. They were 200 meters up the path before it came back out onto the ridge trail behind them. Sierra heard it. She glanced back once. It was looking in their direction. "Run," she said. They ran. Sierra ran last. She ran backward for the first 20 meters, watching the creature, making sure it had not locked onto the group. It stood at the edge of the path, neck extended, head turning slowly. Then it turned away and disappeared back into the canopy. She turned and ran properly, catching up with the group as the plateau came into view through the trees, flat gray rock, wide open sky above it, and the distant silver shape of the boundless inquiry already beginning its descent from orbit. They were almost there. And then the creature came back. It came fast this time from the side, through the thinning trees at the edge of the plateau, and it was not walking anymore. It had made its decision. It was committed. Sierra did not think. She was already moving. She cut left, away from the group, shouting once, loud, sharp, purely to get the creature's attention, and she got it. The creature pivoted toward her and came, and she ran along the tree line parallel to the plateau, buying the group 30 meters, and then 50, and then the creature was close enough that she could feel the ground shake with each step, and she cut right, back toward the plateau, and she was fast. She was very fast, because she had grown up running, and Earth does not let you be slow. She almost made it clean. The creature's forward limb caught her left arm as she turned. It was not a full strike. A glancing blow, claws extended, and it spun her sideways and down, and she hit the ground hard and rolled. She came up on her knees. Her left arm was wrong. She could see that immediately, with the same clear, disconnected observation that extreme adrenaline produces. The sleeve of her jacket was dark and wet. The arm bent at an angle it should not have been, and there was a white edge of bone visible just below the elbow that she looked at for exactly 1 second before she looked away from it and looked at the creature instead. It had stopped. It was looking at her. Behind her she heard the boundless inquiry touch down on the plateau. She heard the ramp engage. She heard Orvith's voice shouting her name. The creature took 1 step forward. Sierra reached across with her right hand, found the emergency wrap in her kit by feel, pulled it out, and bit down on one end of it to hold it while she wound it around her left arm with her right hand, tight, pulling it firm with her teeth until the wrap sealed. The arm screamed. She breathed through her nose and finished the wrap. Then she stood up. She stood up straight, and she turned her back on the creature, and she walked toward the ramp. Behind her, the creature watched. It did not follow. Whether it was surprised, or whether something in the way she moved told it that this particular prey was more trouble than it was worth, she would never know. She walked up the ramp. The group was there, pressed back against the interior wall of the ship's loading bay, and every one of them was staring at her. Thel, Korath, Vel, the 6 others, all of them with their various sets of eyes wide, and Orvith at the front, tablet forgotten in his hand, looking at her arm and then at her face. The ramp closed behind her. The ship began to lift. Sierra sat down on the floor of the loading bay, her back against the wall, her wrapped arm resting across her knee. She looked at it for a moment, clinically, the way you look at a problem that is serious but not immediately fatal. Then she looked up at the 12 faces staring at her. "Someone want to get the medical unit," she said, "and maybe some coffee." Nobody moved for a second, and then everyone moved at once. The medical bay of the UIS Boundless Inquiry was not designed with humans in mind. That was not unusual. Most things in the Union were not designed with humans in mind. Humanity was too new, too small, too recently arrived to have left much of a mark on the infrastructure of a civilization that had been building itself for thousands of years. The beds were slightly too long, the lighting slightly too blue, and the medical scanner made a sound when it worked that Sierra found quietly irritating, a high thin hum just at the edge of hearing. None of that mattered much. The arm was set and sealed and wrapped in a regenerative compress that the ship's physician, a careful and now very wide-eyed Shalari doctor named Esavith, had applied with slightly shaking hands. The bone was clean. The tissue damage was significant but manageable. In 6 to 8 weeks, with proper treatment, the arm would be fully functional. "Your cellular repair process is," Esavith paused, searching for the right word. "Faster than I expected," she said finally. "The tissue around the wound is already responding. The rate is nearly double what I would project for a being of your size and mass." "We heal fast," Sierra said. She was sitting up on the medical bed with her arm in the compress and a cup of actual coffee in her right hand, which she had asked for 3 times before someone finally brought it. She drank it slowly and looked at the ceiling. "Is that common for humans?" "Common enough," Sierra said. "We've had a lot of practice needing to." Esavith wrote something in her notes and then stood there for a moment, clearly wanting to ask more questions and equally clearly unsure if it was appropriate. In the end, she simply nodded, tidied her equipment, and left Sierra alone. The ship moved through the dark on its way back to Velshar Prime. Outside the small window above the medical bed, the stars were cold and still and very far apart. Orvith came on the second day. He did not knock, the door was open, but he stood in the doorway for a moment before coming in, which was as close to knocking as Shalari etiquette allowed. He had his tablet with him, as always, but he was not reading it. He held it at his side and looked at Sierra with an expression she had not seen on him before. It was not the brisk, efficient look he wore in briefings. It was not the careful, composed look he had worn on Keth 4 when things were going wrong, and he was managing his response to that. It was something quieter, something that, on a human face, she would have called unsettled. He sat down in the chair beside the bed without being invited, which meant he had been thinking about this visit long enough that he had moved past the point of asking permission. "The report is giving me difficulty," he said. "What kind of difficulty?" Sierra asked. "The kind where I am not sure what to write." He set the tablet on his knee. "Everything I was sent to prove has been disproven. The planet is not manageable. The reclassification was wrong. 3 researchers nearly died from a toxin that our equipment did not detect and our protocols did not prepare us for. The seismic event was listed as minor, and it destroyed our base camp. The apex predator was not in the survey catalog at all." He looked at his tablet and then back at her. "And the only reason all 12 of us are on this ship, and not dead on that plateau, is because of you." Sierra said nothing. She drank her coffee. "I want to understand something," Orvith said, "and I am asking sincerely, not as a critique. How did you know? Not any one thing, the plant, the animals before the flood, the predator's behavior, all of it. How did you carry all of that in your head at once and know what to do with it?" Sierra was quiet for a moment. She looked at the window and the stars outside. "I grew up on a planet that does that," she said. "Not as extreme as Keth 4, but the same idea. The weather can kill you. The animals can kill you. The microbes absolutely will try to kill you if you give them a reason. There are places on Earth where the ground itself will swallow you, or the temperature will drop 40 degrees in 3 hours, or a fire will cover 100 kilometers before anyone realizes it started." She paused. "You grow up there and you learn to read things. You learn that quiet is not always safe, that beautiful is not always gentle, that the first sign of danger is almost never the danger itself. It's something smaller, something easy to miss, something that the planet is doing 10 minutes before it decides to remind you what it is." Orvith listened to all of this without speaking. "Every human learns that," Sierra continued. "Not always the same way, not always the same lessons, but the same idea underneath all of it. Stay alert, trust the signs, move before the problem becomes the problem." She looked at him. "You called it not being afraid. It's not that. It's just we've been afraid for so long that we learn to function inside of it. Fear is not the end of the process for us. It's the beginning." Orvith was silent for a long time. Long enough that Sierra finished her coffee and set the cup on the small ledge beside the bed. "I am going to recommend reinstatement of the Deathworld classification," he said finally. "Keth 4 at minimum, likely the full original list pending review." He looked at his tablet. "And I am going to recommend that the Union formally study humanity's adaptive responses to hostile environments as a scientific resource, not as a curiosity." He looked up. "I want to write this correctly. I do not want it to sound like," he paused, searching. "I do not want it to sound like I am treating your people as something unusual or lesser." "You can say we come from a hard place," Sierra said simply. "That's not an insult, we know it. We're proud of it." Something in Orvith's expression shifted. Not much, but enough. "You abstained," he said, "at the conclave when the vote was taken." "Yes." "You knew." "I had a reasonable suspicion," she said, which was what she had told him about the plan on Keth 4, and they both remembered that. And both understood she meant the same thing now. She had known. She had simply chosen not to make a speech about it in a hall full of beings who were not ready to hear it yet. Orvith stood up. He held the tablet at his side and looked at her for a moment with all 6 of his eyes, which was the Shalari way of giving someone your full and complete attention. "Thank you, Delegate Vance," he said, "for all of us." She gave him the same small nod she had given him on Keth 4 after she stabilized Vel. He turned and left. The report went out 2 weeks after they docked at Velshar Prime. It was thorough. It was precise. It contained Orvith's full field observations, Esavith's medical notes, the environmental data from Keth 4, and a formal recommendation to reinstate the Deathworld classification with immediate effect. It also contained a 3-page addendum, written in Orvith's exact and careful language, on the subject of human beings, where they came from, what that place had made of them, and why the Union would do well to pay attention to that. The report spread across the Union's data network quickly. Scientists read it. Delegates read it. News editors on a dozen worlds ran summaries of it. Within a month, it had been downloaded more times than any field report in the Union's recent history. The emergency session of the Grand Conclave was called 6 weeks after docking. The Grand Hall was full again. The same sweeping curve of seats, the same pale walls, the same carefully balanced air, the same presiding arbiter at the center, with its 4 arms and its wet gravel voice. The holographic display behind the platform showed the empty registry, the clean list where 31 red-sigiled planets had once sat before they were wiped away in a single unanimous vote. The motion on the floor was simple: reinstate the Deathworld classification, restore the full list of 31 planets pending individual review, add Keth 4. The presiding arbiter called the vote. In the back row of the human section, Sierra Vance sat with her left arm in a recovery brace, pale blue and fitted close to her forearm, and a cup of station coffee in her right hand. The station coffee was bad as always. She drank it anyway. The vote prompt appeared on every panel. Around the hall, the sounds of agreement were immediate and quiet and total. No debate, no speeches, the kind of vote that happens when everyone in the room has already made up their mind. The tally came up on the big display. 37 species, 37 yes votes. The Deathworld classification was reinstated. Sierra looked at the tally board for a long moment. She did not say anything. She did not raise her fist or nod in satisfaction or look at anyone else in the hall with any expression that could be read as triumph. She just looked at the board and then looked down at her cup and took another sip of the bad coffee. She did not say, "I told you so." She would not have said that. It was not the point. It had never been the point. The point was the list. The 32 red sigils now sitting in the registry where they belonged, warnings to anyone who came after, anyone who would travel out into the dark and find those places and need to know what they were getting into. The point was that somewhere out there, on a jungle ocean world with bioluminescent forests and golden canopies, and a coastal shelf that flooded without warning, there were creatures that had no name in any catalog yet. And there were microbes in the soil and toxins on the feet of small dark animals, and a long-necked predator the size of a building that moved through the trees like silence given weight. And the next team that went there would know. They would know because of the report, because of Orvith's careful, honest words, because of what happened to 12 beings on a planet that the Union had decided, in a comfortable hall far from the outer systems, could not possibly be that bad. And maybe, just maybe, they would bring a human with them. Someone who grew up knowing that quiet is not always safe, that beautiful is not always gentle, that you check the plants first, and you watch the animals, and you keep your kit close, and you do not stop moving just because the thing trying to stop you is bigger than you are. Someone who, if the worst happened, would wrap their own arm with their own teeth and stand up and walk away from it. Not because they were not afraid, but because they came from a place that had spent 4 billion years teaching its children that fear is not the end of anything. It is just where you start.